My name is Delaney, and I'm 34 years old. Every year, I tell myself Thanksgiving is just another day. Nothing special, nothing I should let hurt me anymore. But somehow, every year, I let myself hope things will be different. This year was no exception. I had packed a pie I'd baked from scratch, dressed in my nicest sweater, and told myself that maybe, just maybe, I'd finally be seen as part of the family instead of an outsider looking in. The drive to my Aunt Lorraine's house was long and heavy with anticipation. The trees along the road were bare, their branches twisting against a gray November sky. It matched the knot in my stomach. I tried to push away memories of past holidays, of whispered jokes I wasn't supposed to hear, of being shuffled aside when the table got crowded. Maybe this time would be different, I told myself. People grow, families change, and time has a way of softening hearts. When I arrived, the driveway was already packed with cars. My cousin's shiny SUVs lined up in a neat row, while I squeezed my old sedan into a patch of gravel near the edge. The sound of laughter floated from the house as I grabbed my pie and walked to the front door. Before I even knocked, I could hear them voices loud and bright, clinking glasses, the scrape of chairs against wood floors. Aunt Lorraine opened the door with her usual forced smile. "Delaney, you made it," she said, her eyes flicking down at my pie as if to assess whether it was good enough to contribute. She didn't hug me. She never did. Inside, the warmth of roasted turkey and cinnamon hit me, but it couldn't mask the coldness in the room. My cousins turned their heads when I entered, offering quick glances and polite nods, but no one rushed to greet me. The dining room table was already set long, elegant, and overflowing with crystal glasses, folded napkins, and polished silverware. Every chair seemed filled, though I knew they had known I was coming. I hesitated near the doorway, clutching my pie like a shield. "Where should I put this?" I asked. My cousin Brielle smirked from her seat. "Oh, just leave it in the kitchen. That's where you'll be sitting anyway." Her words were casual, but they sliced through me like a knife. Aunt Lorraine cleared her throat and chimed in smoothly. "Yes, sweetheart. The table's a bit full this year. You'll be more comfortable in the kitchen. There's a little setup for you there." For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. My ears buzzed with embarrassment as every face at the table turned toward me. Some of them looked down quickly, pretending not to notice. Others, like my Uncle Howard, wore smug little smiles as if this arrangement was perfectly natural. "The kitchen?" I repeated, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be. "Yes," Aunt Lorraine said, waving her hand dismissively. "It's just easier this way. You understand." The room filled with muffled laughter. My cousin Talia whispered something to the person next to her, and they both chuckled. My cheeks burned hot, and my chest tightened until I thought I might not be able to breathe. I wanted to shout. I wanted to slam the pie onto their perfect table and demand to know why. After all these years, I was always the one excluded, the one made small. But my voice failed me. Instead, I forced my lips into a tight smile, nodded once, and carried my pie into the kitchen. The kitchen table was a tiny, round thing tucked into the corner, half covered with mail and grocery bags. A single chair had been cleared for me, next to the hum of the refrigerator. There was no place setting, no folded napkin, no glass of wine waiting like at the big table. Just an empty spot, as if they'd only remembered me at the last minute. I set the pie down and lowered myself into the chair, my hands trembling. Through the doorway, I could hear them clinking glasses, laughing loudly, calling out stories that didn't include me. The sound of their joy was salt in my wound. I stared at the pie, at the perfect crust I'd spent hours on, and suddenly it looked pathetic. My hands curled into fists. I was 34 years old, and here I was, shoved into the kitchen like a child who didn't belong. Memories flooded me: childhood birthdays when my gifts were mocked as cheap, Christmas mornings when my cousins flaunted their expensive presents while mine were brushed aside. Always less, always separate. Always not enough. And now at Thanksgiving they'd made it official. I wasn't family enough to sit at the table. I pressed my nails into my palms until it hurt, just to ground myself. I thought of leaving, of walking out the front door and never speaking to them again. But something inside me hardened instead. I swallowed the tears burning in my throat and stared through the doorway at their smiling faces. They thought they had put me in my place. But all they had done was awaken something I had kept buried for far too long. I sat quietly in the kitchen that night, but my mind was anything but still. With every laugh that drifted in from the dining room, I built a wall inside me, a wall of determination, anger, and resolve. They could shut me out of their table, but they had no idea what I carried in my memory, in my files, in the truths they thought I had forgotten. They believed they'd won by pushing me aside. But what they didn't realize was that this moment, this humiliation, was the spark that would ignite everything to come. I didn't argue with them that night. I didn't storm out or cause a scene. I simply sat in the kitchen, silent, patient, already planning the storm I would unleash on them all. I sat in that cramped kitchen corner, staring at the uneven pattern of the linoleum floor, and tried to convince myself it was just one bad night. Families had awkward moments all the time. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was too sensitive. That's what they'd always told me, after all. But the truth gnawed at me. This wasn't just a bad dinner. This was the latest in a long line of moments where my family had shoved me aside, making sure I never forgot my place in their hierarchy. The longer I sat there, listening to the roar of laughter from the dining room, the more memories bubbled up, ugly, sharp ones I had tried to bury. I remembered being 9 years old at my cousin Brielle's birthday party. She tore the wrapping paper off my carefully chosen gift, a doll I had begged my mom to buy with her limited money. Brielle had wrinkled her nose, muttering, "This looks cheap." The other kids laughed. My mom's face flushed red, but she didn't say anything. And neither did I. Then there was the Christmas when I was 16. My cousins all unwrapped new gadgets, phones, designer clothes, expensive jewelry, while my gift was a knitted scarf that Aunt Lorraine had clearly picked up last minute. I wore it all day, pretending I loved it, but when I saw it tossed in the trash on my way out, something inside me cracked. And there were the family reunions, the endless barbecues, where I always ended up at the folding table in the back, near the trash cans, while everyone else sat at the long wooden picnic benches. They always said it was because there wasn't enough room. But somehow, there was always room for someone else. I had spent my whole life trying to earn a seat at their table, only to realize I'd never been welcome in the first place. That night, sitting in the kitchen while they laughed without me, it all finally connected. This wasn't about a crowded table or a lack of chairs. It was about power. It was about control. And it was about keeping me in my place, small, insignificant, and easy to dismiss. For years I had swallowed their cruelty, telling myself it wasn't worth making waves. I thought if I just smiled enough, worked hard enough, or brought the right dish to Thanksgiving, maybe they'd let me in. But they never did. The truth was, they didn't see me as family. They saw me as less. And the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I clenched my fists on my lap, my nails digging into my skin. My pie sat untouched on the counter. I heard them praising Brielle's store-bought dessert, their voices rising in exaggerated delight. No one came to check on me. No one even acknowledged that I wasn't at the table. The humiliation burned. But underneath it, something else was forming. Something sharper, colder. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just sad. I wasn't just hurt. I was furious. And in that fury, a thought crept in. This didn't have to be the end of the story. For years I had brushed off the family whispers, the hushed conversations I wasn't supposed to hear. I remembered nights when I was younger, lying in bed, listening to my mother talk in low tones about the family money, about the inheritance, about how things had been divided up unfairly after my grandmother passed away. At the time, I hadn't understood. But now, as an adult, the pieces started clicking into place. They hadn't just excluded me from their table, they had excluded me from what was rightfully mine. My mind drifted back to the day I cleaned out my mother's old files after she passed. I had found envelopes stuffed with photocopies of papers, legal-looking documents with my grandmother's name at the top. I hadn't known what to do with them back then, so I tucked them away in a shoebox at the back of my closet. But now, I realized those papers might be more than old family relics. They might be my weapon. The thought sent a chill down my spine. I pictured myself standing in a courtroom, those same smug faces from the dining table forced to look at me differently. I imagined them squirming under the weight of their lies, finally stripped of their power. The sound of their laughter carried through the doorway, jarring me back into the present. I stared at the shadows flickering on the wall, their silhouettes moving as they toasted and celebrated. They thought they had humiliated me. They thought they had won. But what they didn't realize was that this Thanksgiving was different. This wasn't just another cruel moment I would swallow and carry in silence. This was the breaking point. And when I broke, I didn't crumble. I sharpened. I sat there until the dishes were cleared, until the voices quieted and people began putting on their coats. Not one of them came into the kitchen to say goodbye. Not one of them thanked me for coming. As I drove home in the dark, the pie still intact in the passenger seat, I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The silence of the car was deafening, but inside my head, plans were forming. I wasn't going to let this go, not this time. I had been pushed aside for the last time. I was done being the forgotten cousin, the invisible niece, the outsider who didn't belong at the table. They wanted me in the kitchen. They wanted me silent, but I had something they didn't know I carried. And soon, they were going to find out just how dangerous it was to underestimate me. That night, as I pulled into my driveway, I knew with absolute clarity, I wasn't just angry about a bad dinner. I was preparing for a war they never saw coming. The night after Thanksgiving, I sat at my kitchen table with the untouched pie in front of me. The silence of my house pressing in like a heavy blanket. I hadn't even bothered to turn on the lights when I got home. The glow from the street lamp outside was enough to remind me that I was alone. But loneliness wasn't the only thing I felt. Beneath it pulsed something darker, an ember of rage that refused to die down. I replayed the night over and over in my head, each cruel laugh, each dismissive glance, each smug face at the dining table. And with every replay I saw something new, a pattern, a history, a truth I had tried to ignore. This wasn't about chairs or space at a table, this was about being erased. And deep down, I knew they had been erasing me for far longer than just holiday meals. I thought back to when I was 25, standing in my mother's small, cluttered living room after her funeral. I had been sorting through her things, still numb with grief, when I stumbled across an old shoebox tucked behind a stack of photo albums. At first, I thought it was filled with random scraps, yellowed receipts, letters with faded ink, and papers that smelled faintly of mildew. My grandmother's name was on nearly every page. Some were property deeds. Others looked like legal documents, stamped with official seals. And one, crumpled and folded at the edges, looked very much like part of a will. Back then, I didn't fully understand what I was looking at. I was grieving, exhausted, and barely able to keep myself together. So I tucked the papers back into the shoebox and shoved it into the back of my closet. For years, I let it collect dust, telling myself it was too complicated to deal with. But that Thanksgiving night, sitting in my dark kitchen, the memory of those papers came rushing back like a spark on dry tinder. I pushed the pie aside and went straight to my bedroom closet. My hands shook as I pulled the shoebox down from the shelf. The cardboard sagged with age, but it was still intact. I carried it to the table, my heart pounding as if I were opening a vault of secrets. Inside, the documents were just as I remembered, yellowed, fragile, but legible. I spread them out carefully, one by one. There were property records showing land in my grandmother's name that had mysteriously changed hands just months after her death. There were bank account statements with balances far larger than what anyone had ever mentioned. And then there was the will, or at least a portion of it. It was handwritten, shaky but clear enough to read. My grandmother's words leapt off the page. She wanted her estate divided fairly among all her children and their descendants. And there, in unmistakable ink, was my name. I froze. My breath caught in my chest. All these years I had believed the story my family told that my grandmother hadn't left much behind, that there wasn't anything worth dividing. They had repeated it so often, with such certainty, that I never questioned it. But the papers told a different story. A story of assets, wealth, and deliberate silence. Suddenly, everything clicked. The smug way my cousins bragged about their new cars, their vacations, their investments. The way Aunt Lorraine's house seemed to get bigger every year. The way they treated me like an afterthought. As if I didn't matter. It wasn't just cruelty, it was strategy. They had known about the will. They had known about the money. And they had buried it along with my place in the family. The realization made my stomach twist with both anger and clarity. They hadn't just humiliated me at the table, they had stolen from me. They had lied to me. They had decided I wasn't worthy of what my grandmother wanted me to have. And for years, I had let them get away with it. Not anymore. I sat there for hours, reading every word, every line, every number. My hands grew cold as I flipped through bank statements showing deposits I never knew existed. I traced the signatures on property deeds that had been transferred suspiciously fast. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed a picture I couldn't ignore. They thought I was naive. They thought I would never notice. They thought I would always sit quietly in the kitchen, grateful for scraps. But I wasn't that person anymore. That night, I realized I had power. Not just emotional power, but legal power. These papers weren't just old documents, they were evidence of fraud, evidence of theft, evidence of betrayal so deep it made my skin crawl. I leaned back in my chair, the shoebox still open in front of me, and stared at the ceiling. My grandmother's face floated into my mind, kind, wrinkled, always smelling faintly of lavender. She had loved me. I knew she had. And she had wanted me to have a share of her legacy. My family had stolen that from me. I pressed my hand to the papers, my pulse racing beneath my skin. For the first time in my life, I felt like I held the upper hand. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about justice. About honoring the woman who had believed in me when no one else did. About making sure her wishes were respected, even if it meant tearing my family apart in the process. Because if they thought they could erase me, they were wrong. By the time dawn light began to seep through my blinds, I knew what I had to do. I would take these documents to someone who understood them better than I did. I would find out if I had a case. And if I did, I wouldn't hesitate. I imagined the look on their faces when the truth came out. The smugness wiped clean, the laughter silenced. The shock of realizing that the person they had shoved into the kitchen was the same person who now held their futures in her hands. It was almost enough to make me smile. Almost, because I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. They would fight me. They would deny it. They would try to destroy me the way they always had. But this time, I wasn't coming unarmed. And as I closed the shoebox and set it firmly on the table, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had the secret that could bring them all down. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, the smirks, the dismissive glances, the way they waved me off like I was nothing. But now those images came with something new. The papers spread out across my table, glowing in my memory like a weapon waiting to be used. By sunrise, I knew I couldn't sit on this secret any longer. I needed to know if what I had was real, if it meant what I thought it did. I needed someone who could tell me whether I was chasing shadows or holding dynamite in my hands. That's when I thought of Sabrina. I'd met her a year earlier at a community fundraiser. She was an attorney, sharp as a blade, the kind of woman whose presence made a room quiet down without her having to say a word. At the time, she'd handed me her business card with a polite smile, probably expecting I'd never use it, but I had tucked it into my wallet anyway, not knowing why. Now, I knew why. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed the number. My heart pounded as the line rang, each second stretching out like an eternity. Law offices of Sabrina Castillo, how may I help you? A receptionist answered, her voice calm and professional. I swallowed hard. My name is Delaney. I need to speak with Miss Castillo. It's urgent. There was a pause. Then soft typing. She has a cancellation in an hour. Can you come in? My pulse quickened. Yes. I'll be there. I grabbed the shoebox, stuffed the papers back inside, and headed out the door. The drive downtown felt surreal, my hands tight on the wheel. For years, I'd accepted my family's narrative that I was powerless, insignificant. Now, for the first time, I was on my way to see if that story could be rewritten. Sabrina's office was on the 12th floor of a glass building that gleamed in the morning light. I stepped into the waiting room, clutching the shoebox like it was my lifeline. The receptionist led me back to Sabrina's office, where she sat behind a sleek desk, dressed in a tailored navy suit that radiated authority. "Delaney," she said warmly, standing to shake my hand. "It's been a while." "What brings you here?" My throat tightened. I placed the shoebox on her desk and said, "This." Her eyebrows arched as I pulled out the papers. I explained everything: the Thanksgiving dinner, the years of being pushed aside, the whispers about money, and the discovery in my mother's things. My voice shook, but I forced myself to keep going. Sabrina listened without interrupting, her sharp eyes scanning each page with meticulous care. The silence stretched as she flipped through the documents, pausing now and then to scribble notes. Finally, she looked up, her expression unreadable. "Delaney, do you realize what you have here?" I shook my head. "I think it's my grandmother's will. But I don't understand all of it." "It's more than that," she said, tapping the papers. "This looks like evidence of probate fraud. If what you've told me is true, and if these documents are authentic, your family may have deliberately concealed assets from the court. That's illegal, very illegal." Her words hit me like a jolt of electricity. "So, I could do something about this?" She leaned back, folding her hands. "Yes. You could file a lawsuit to reopen the estate. You could demand a full accounting of assets. If your name was deliberately excluded, and you were entitled to a share, we can pursue that in court. But I need to warn you, it won't be easy. Cases like this are messy, emotional, and expensive. Your family will fight you tooth and nail." I let out a shaky breath. "They've already fought me my whole life. I'm not afraid of that anymore." A small smile tugged at her lips. "Good. Because if we move forward, you need to be prepared for a war. But from what I see here, you have a strong starting point." She slid a pen and intake form across the desk. My hand trembled as I signed, but it wasn't from fear, it was from adrenaline. For the first time in years, I felt like I was stepping into my own power. Sabrina spent the next hour outlining what we needed to do. Authenticate the will, request probate court records, investigate asset transfers, and prepare a formal complaint. Each word she spoke felt like another brick being laid in a wall of protection around me. When I finally left her office, shoebox lighter in my hands, the world outside looked different. The sky seemed clearer, the air sharper. For years I had carried the weight of being unwanted, of being invisible. Now I carried something else, a plan. Driving home, I imagined the day my family would be forced to look me in the eye in a courtroom. The thought made my chest tighten, but not with fear, with anticipation. They had no idea what was coming. They thought I was weak, compliant, someone who would sit quietly in the kitchen forever. But now, I had an ally, a weapon, a way forward. And I wasn't going to stop until every single one of them knew what it felt like to be powerless. That night, as I set the shoebox back on my table, I didn't feel small anymore. I didn't feel erased. I felt dangerous. Because with one phone call I had set into motion a chain of events that would change everything, and this time, I was the one holding the pen that would write the ending. When I woke the next morning, there was no hesitation left in me. The doubt that had haunted me for years, the question of whether I was overreacting, whether my family's cruelty was just how they were, was gone. What I had in my hands wasn't just memory or hurt feelings, it was proof. And Sabrina had given me the clarity I needed. This wasn't only about humiliation at a dinner table. This was about theft, about fraud, about a legacy stolen from me. I spent the next few weeks working with Sabrina as if it were my second job. Every evening after work, I'd drive straight to her office, the shoebox of papers in my arms, my laptop full of new notes. She had a way of looking at things that made me see my family differently, not as untouchable forces towering above me, but as people who had made mistakes, paper trails, and lies that could be exposed. Our first step was gathering everything I had. Sabrina asked me to comb through my mother's old files again, and I did. I spent hours pulling dusty boxes from closets, flipping through drawers full of forgotten paperwork. I found tax records, old letters, even handwritten notes my mother had scribbled about conversations with my aunt and uncle. Each scrap of paper felt like another thread we could pull to unravel their scheme. Sabrina also filed requests with the county courthouse for probate records from when my grandmother's estate was originally settled. I'll never forget the look on her face when the clerk handed over the file. It was thin. Too thin. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered, flipping through the sparse documents. "An estate of this size should have far more detail. This looks incomplete." Incomplete. That word stuck with me like a thorn. My family had made sure the official record looked tidy, as though there was nothing to question. But Sabrina explained something important. The absence of evidence, when evidence should exist, can be its own kind of proof. Meanwhile, I started keeping a private log of everything my relatives posted online. Every casual brag slipped into conversations at family functions. My cousin Talia was the worst offender. She loved to post pictures of her new vacation home in Florida, glass of champagne in hand, captioning it, "Earned, not given." I dug deeper and found that the property had once been listed under my grandmother's name years before it was mysteriously sold for a suspiciously low price. My Uncle Howard wasn't much better. He boasted about his business ventures, but Sabrina traced some of his startup money back to accounts linked to my grandmother's estate. The more we looked, the clearer the picture became. They had siphoned off her wealth for themselves, hiding it under the cover of family silence. Each discovery fueled me. It was like standing outside their perfect Thanksgiving table, except now I was peeking behind the curtain. I could see how flimsy their empire really was, built on lies and greed. But preparation wasn't only about evidence. It was about me. Sabrina warned me that once the lawsuit was filed, my family would come after me with everything they had. They would try to paint me as bitter, unstable, ungrateful. They would drag my name through the mud. "You need to be ready," she said firmly during one of our late-night strategy sessions. "They're going to attack you personally, not just legally. If you let that shake you, they'll win." I nodded, but inside, I was terrified. For so long I had lived in the shadow of their disapproval, desperate for a crumb of acceptance. Now I had to stand against them entirely. But fear or not, I was done being silent. So I prepared myself in other ways. I wrote down every memory of mistreatment, every holiday where I'd been excluded, every comment that had chipped away at my sense of worth. Not because those things were legally useful, but because they reminded me why I was fighting. Whenever doubt crept in, I reread my notes and let the anger wash back over me. The deeper we dug, the more dangerous this became. Sabrina explained that if fraud was proven, not only could assets be redistributed, but criminal charges might be possible. My family didn't just risk losing money, they risked losing everything. And yet, they still had no idea. At family gatherings, I smiled and nodded as though nothing had changed. I sat through small talk, listening to them brag about their lives, all while my phone buzzed with updates from Sabrina. Each text, each email was another nail in the coffin they didn't even know was being built. The strangest part was the calm I began to feel. For years I had been anxious around them, desperate not to make waves. Now I was steady. Their words couldn't touch me anymore, because I knew the truth. I knew what was coming. It reminded me of standing outside in the moments before a storm when the air grows heavy, the wind stills, and the world seems to hold its breath. That was me, waiting, preparing, knowing the thunder was inevitable. Every night, as I closed my eyes, I pictured the same scene, me standing in front of them, not in a cramped kitchen but in a courtroom, their laughter silenced, their smug smiles wiped away. That vision became my anchor, pulling me through the endless research, the exhausting nights, the constant fear that maybe I was wrong. But I wasn't wrong. I could feel it in my bones. By the time Sabrina told me we were ready to draft the lawsuit, I wasn't the same woman who had been shoved into the kitchen on Thanksgiving night. I was harder now. Sharper. I didn't just want justice, I wanted them to feel every ounce of the humiliation they had poured into me for years. And I knew the best way to do that wasn't through yelling or crying or begging. It was through quiet, undeniable proof, delivered in a way that would destroy the perfect little world they had built for themselves. They thought they could hide their secrets forever. But I was about to expose them all, and nothing would ever be the same again. Living a double life was strange at first. By day, I showed up to work like nothing had changed, smiling at coworkers, finishing projects, laughing at small talk. By night, I became a silent investigator, combing through files, following paper trails, documenting every slip my family made in public. The most satisfying part? They had no idea. To them, I was still the quiet cousin, the woman they could shove into a kitchen without consequence. They had no clue that every bragging comment, every careless post, every whispered boast about money was being tucked neatly into a folder with their names on it. I started with my cousin Talia. She was addicted to social media, posting constantly about her boss babe lifestyle. One night, scrolling through her feed, I found pictures of her standing in front of a beach house with the caption, "Finally ours." My eyes narrowed. The house looked familiar. I dug into old records and, sure enough, that property had belonged to my grandmother 20 years ago. It was supposed to have been sold as part of the estate settlement, but according to Sabrina, the sale price listed was far below market value. That beach house was a stolen inheritance, wrapped in Instagram filters and champagne glasses. I screenshotted everything, labeling the file Evidence, Talia. Then there was my Uncle Howard. He loved boasting about his self-made businesses at family gatherings. But Sabrina showed me the trail of seed money, tracing back to accounts suspiciously linked to my grandmother's estate. Transfers had been made quietly, disguised as loans that were never repaid. I remembered sitting across from him one Christmas when he'd sneered, "Not everyone gets to be successful, Delaney. Some people just don't have the drive." At the time, his words had cut deep. Now they just made me laugh bitterly. His so-called drive had come from money that wasn't his. I created another file. Evidence, Howard. The more I dug, the more patterns emerged. Luxury cars purchased months after assets were liquidated. Vacations taken suspiciously close to estate, account withdrawals. Even Brielle's wedding, which had been flaunted as the event of the year, was partly funded by checks that shouldn't have existed. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. And they had been too arrogant to notice anyone watching. Sometimes, the irony was almost too much to bear. They thought I was invisible. They thought I was irrelevant. But invisibility made me the perfect observer. While they laughed me out of rooms, I was cataloging their downfall. I kept meticulous notes. Dates, times, account numbers, property transfers, screenshots of posts before they could be deleted. I filled binders with printouts, each one a piece of a puzzle they didn't know was being assembled. And every time I added another page, I felt stronger. At family events, I played the role I'd always been cast in, quiet, compliant, sitting on the sidelines. Inside, though, I was a hawk circling above, seeing everything. My cousins bragged about their lives. My aunt boasted about her new kitchen renovations. My uncle dropped hints about another investment. They thought they were impressing me. They didn't realize they were handing me ammunition. It became a strange game. I'd smile, nod, and ask just enough questions to keep them talking. And they always did so, eager to flaunt what they had, never imagining I could use their own words against them. I'll never forget one particular moment. At a summer barbecue, Brielle leaned over with a smirk and said, "You should really think about investing, Delaney. Of course, you'd need money to do that." Her laughter was sharp, cutting. I forced a smile. But my recorder was already running in my bag, catching every word. Later, Sabrina and I listened to it together. She shook her head in disbelief. "They really don't think you'll ever fight back, do they?" I smiled for real that time. "No. And that's what makes this so perfect." The truth was, their arrogance was my greatest weapon. They flaunted stolen wealth openly, convinced of their own superiority. They didn't bother covering their tracks because, in their minds, I wasn't worth the effort. But I was watching. And the more I watched, the more determined I became. Some nights, I'd sit in my living room surrounded by stacks of evidence, staring at the growing mountain of proof. The anger that once made me shake now made me sharp, focused. I no longer felt like the excluded girl at the kitchen table. I felt like a hunter, patient and relentless. I thought about my grandmother often during those nights. I imagined her disapproving frown if she could see what they had done with her legacy. She had loved fairness, valued honesty. She would have wanted her will respected. Remembering her steadied me. This wasn't just revenge, it was justice. Still, I knew the danger. Sabrina warned me that my family would lash out when they discovered what I was doing. They wouldn't care that I had proof. They would paint me as bitter, vindictive, unhinged. They would twist the narrative to make me the villain. That fear lingered in the back of my mind. But every time it tried to root itself, I thought about Thanksgiving night, about being shoved into the kitchen like I wasn't worth a chair at the table. That memory burned hotter than fear. They had written me off. But they didn't realize that invisibility had given me the perfect vantage point. And while they kept laughing, kept bragging, kept flaunting their stolen riches, I was documenting every single thing, preparing for the day their arrogance would finally catch up with them. The morning I filed the lawsuit, the air felt different. Sharper, heavier, almost electric, as if the world itself knew what I was about to do. I woke before dawn, lying in bed with my heart pounding, staring at the ceiling as my mind played through every possible outcome. What if they destroyed me? What if the case fell apart? What if I was left looking foolish, the bitter cousin who couldn't let things go? But then I remembered Thanksgiving night, the humiliation of being pointed toward the kitchen, the smug smiles as they shut me out. That memory burned away the fear. I swung my legs out of bed, planted my feet firmly on the floor, and told myself, this is the day everything changes. I dressed carefully, not in anything flashy, but in clothes that made me feel grounded. Black slacks, a crisp blouse, and my grandmother's silver pendant around my neck. It was the only piece of hers I had been allowed to keep, and I wore it like armor. When I arrived at Sabrina's office, she was already waiting with a neat stack of papers on her desk. The lawsuit. My weapon. My voice finally set down in ink. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses. Are you ready? I swallowed, my mouth dry. Yes. Once you sign, there's no going back. They'll come at you hard. You need to be certain. I nodded. I've been silent my whole life. I'm done being certain of nothing. She slid the papers toward me. My hand trembled as I picked up the pen. The weight of it strangely heavy. Line by line, signature by signature, I put my name to the document that would shatter the family's illusion of control. The final flourish of ink felt like the closing of a chapter and the opening of another. Sabrina gathered the papers, her movements brisk and precise. That's it, we'll file them today. We drove together to the courthouse. I remember the sound of my heels on the marble floor, echoing louder than I expected, like a drum beat marking the moment. My palms were sweaty, my stomach in knots, but underneath the nerves was something else, pride. When the clerk stamped the papers, I felt a strange rush, like air finally filling my lungs after years of suffocation. It was official. The lawsuit was filed. My family's empire of lies now had a legal spotlight shining on it. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt taller somehow, like I had shed a version of myself I didn't need anymore. The version that sat quietly in kitchens and swallowed insults without protest. Sabrina placed a hand on my shoulder as we stepped into the sunlight. You've just declared war, Delaney, but you're not alone. We'll fight this together. Her words steadied me, but they also reminded me of the reality. This was just the beginning. The storm hadn't hit yet, but it would. That night, I sat at my kitchen table again, the same place where I'd first rediscovered my grandmother's papers. Only this time, the table didn't feel like a place of mourning or defeat. It felt like a war room. I imagined their faces when the process server knocked on their doors. My aunt's perfect smile cracking. My uncle's arrogance evaporating. My cousins scrambling to understand how the cousin they mocked had the power to drag them into court. For years, they had treated me as if I didn't exist. But soon, they wouldn't be able to ignore me. My name would be on every document, every hearing, every headline in the courthouse, and there was no erasing ink. Still, the weight of what I had done pressed on me. Filing the lawsuit wasn't just paperwork, it was a declaration that I was willing to destroy whatever fragile threads of family connection were left. There would be no going back to pretending. I wasn't just standing up for myself. I was burning the bridge behind me. But strangely, that thought didn't scare me. It freed me. Because what good was a bridge that only led to humiliation? In the days that followed, I lived in a strange mix of anticipation and dread. I knew the process server would deliver the papers soon, and when that happened, the silence would end. My phone would ring. My name would be cursed around their dinner table. And the war I had started would begin in earnest. I tried to imagine their conversations, Aunt Lorraine pacing her living room, snapping at my uncle about how dare I challenge them. Brielle calling Talia in a panic, their voices shrill with outrage. My Uncle Howard slamming his fist on the table, already plotting how to discredit me. But the truth was, no matter what they said, no matter how loudly they screamed, the lawsuit existed. They couldn't laugh this away. They couldn't shove me into a kitchen and pretend it wasn't happening. I had forced myself into the center of the story, and they had no choice but to acknowledge me now. Late one night, I stood in front of the mirror, looking at my reflection. For the first time, I didn't see the unwanted cousin or the forgotten niece. I saw a woman who had taken control, who had chosen to stop begging for a seat at the table and instead flipped the entire table over. And as I stared into my own eyes, I whispered aloud, "It begins." Because the day I filed that lawsuit wasn't just paperwork, it wasn't just a legal move. It was the day I stopped being silent, and the day my family finally learned that I wasn't going to stay in the kitchen anymore. A year slipped by faster than I expected, measured not in months but in hearings, filings, and endless nights preparing evidence with Sabrina. My life had become a blur of court dates and strategy meetings. But through it all, one thought stayed in the back of my mind. Thanksgiving was coming again. It felt almost poetic. The very holiday that had broken something inside me the year before now hovered on the horizon, offering me a chance to close the circle. One chilly afternoon in early November, I opened my mailbox to find a cream-colored envelope, thick and pretentious, addressed in my Aunt Lorraine's looping handwriting. Inside was an invitation, Thanksgiving dinner, Lorraine's house, 4 p.m. I laughed out loud, the sound echoing in the quiet of my apartment. After everything, the lawsuit, the depositions, the barely concealed hatred, they still had the audacity to invite me. Or maybe it wasn't audacity. Maybe it was arrogance. The same arrogance that had carried them this far. They thought I'd be too ashamed to show my face. But they were wrong. When I told Sabrina about the invitation, she raised an eyebrow. "You're actually considering going back there?" I nodded slowly. "Not just considering, I'm going. It's the perfect stage." Her lips curved into a sharp smile. "Then it's legal. They can be served anywhere, even at a holiday dinner." The thought of it made my chest tighten with anticipation. Last year, I had been shoved into the kitchen like I was nothing. This year, I would walk through the same door carrying something far more powerful than a pie. In the days leading up to Thanksgiving, I prepared myself not just legally, but emotionally. I picked out a dress in deep red, bold and unapologetic, the opposite of the muted tones I used to wear to avoid attention. I rehearsed what I would say. Though Sabrina reminded me, I didn't need to say much at all, the papers would speak louder than words. Still, I wanted to be ready. This wasn't just about serving them legally. It was about serving them symbolically. I wanted them to remember this moment for the rest of their lives. On Thanksgiving Day, I drove to their house with a calmness that surprised me. My hands were steady on the wheel. My heartbeat, though fast, was controlled. Outside, the trees were bare again. The air sharp with the same November chill I had felt last year. But inside, I was not the same woman. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly as it had a year before, cars lined up, lights glowing warmly through the windows, laughter spilling out faintly into the cold air. For a moment, I stood there, staring at it, letting the memories wash over me, the humiliation, the hurt, the burning resolve. Then I lifted my chin, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the door. Aunt Lorraine opened it, just like last time. Her eyes flicked over my dress, her smile tight. "Delaney," she said, her tone clipped. "I didn't think you'd come." "I wouldn't miss it," I replied, my voice steady. Inside, the scene was eerily familiar. The long dining table, perfectly set with crystal and silverware, cousins clustered together with wine glasses in hand. The same laughter, the same smug faces, as if the past year hadn't happened. But this year, I wasn't holding a pie. I was holding a leather folder tucked neatly under my arm. "Your seat is in the kitchen," my Uncle Howard said with a smirk, clearly eager to put me back in my place. I smiled sweetly. "Of course." I walked into the kitchen, just like last year, and sat in the small chair by the humming refrigerator. But this time, I wasn't trembling. Humiliated. I was waiting. Through the doorway, I could see them raising glasses, carving turkey, toasting to their success. Their laughter rang out, but it no longer cut me, because I knew what was about to happen. At exactly 5, I sent a text message. One word. Now. The doorbell rang a few moments later. Conversation paused, forks clattered onto plates. My aunt rose to answer, and when she opened the door, a man in a crisp suit stepped inside, holding a stack of envelopes. "Lorraine Whitmore?" he asked. "Yes?" she said, confusion flashing across her face. "You've been served." He handed her the first envelope, then turned to my uncle. "Howard Whitmore, you've been served." Gasps filled the dining room as, one by one, each of them was handed their own set of papers. My cousins looked around in shock, their perfect Thanksgiving crumbling around them as the process server methodically went down the line. I stayed in the kitchen doorway, watching. My heart pounded, but not from fear, from exhilaration. For once, I wasn't on the outside looking in, I was the reason their world was spinning off its axis. Brielle's voice was the first to break through the stunned silence. "What is this?" she demanded, waving the papers like they were contaminated. Howard's face turned red as he flipped through the documents. "A lawsuit? Delaney? What the hell do you think you're doing?" I stepped fully into the dining room then, my red dress catching the glow of the chandelier. "This year," I said evenly, "I brought something for everyone." The silence that followed was sweeter than any pie I could have baked. Last year, they had laughed at me from this very table. This year, they couldn't laugh. They couldn't even speak. They could only stare, their forks abandoned, their feast forgotten, as the weight of my papers settled over them like a storm cloud. And in that moment, standing in the very place where they had once humiliated me, I knew the real Thanksgiving had finally begun. The sound of the door clicking shut behind the process server still echoed in the house when I slipped back into the kitchen. It was almost poetic, really. A year ago, I had been forced into this very room like a child being punished. Tonight, I chose to return here on my own. The difference was everything. I sat in the same small chair by the refrigerator, the one that hummed steadily like a heartbeat in the silence. But this time, my hands weren't trembling, my cheeks weren't burning with shame. Instead, I folded my legs, leaned back, and listened. Through the doorway, the dining room had exploded into chaos. Voices overlapped, sharp and panicked. Papers rustled violently as my relatives flipped through the thick envelopes, trying to make sense of the words staring back at them. The clinking of silverware and glasses was gone. So was the laughter. Instead, there was outrage. "This is ridiculous!" my Uncle Howard barked, his voice shaking with fury. "You can't be serious," Brielle cried. "She can't do this." But I could, and I had. I rested my chin on my hand. The kitchen wasn't my prison anymore, it was my sanctuary. It was the vantage point from which I could hear the empire I'd been excluded from crumbling in real time. Every shout that reached my ears was like a melody. Every gasp, every frantic question, every sharp denial, they were music to me. For once, I didn't feel like the forgotten cousin. I felt like the conductor of the orchestra, pulling every note into place with precision. I thought back to last year, how small I'd felt in this same chair. I had clutched the pie like a shield, wishing anyone would look at me and see I belonged. I'd fought tears in the brain silence while they toasted each other at the table. But tonight, they were the ones staring into silence, not me. They were the ones isolated, shocked, and scrambling. I took out my phone and opened the Notes app where I'd been logging every detail of their schemes over the past year. I scrolled slowly, almost lazily, letting the words sink in. Howard's loan cover-up, Brielle's wedding checks. Each entry was another nail in the coffin, another reason why I wasn't wrong to do this. Delaney. Aunt Lorraine's voice cut through the air suddenly. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen, clutching the lawsuit in her shaking hands. Her face was pale, her lips pressed thin. What do you think you're doing? I looked up at her calmly, meeting her eyes without flinching. I said evenly, I'm finally taking my seat at the table, just not the way you expected. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Behind her, my cousins hovered, their faces twisted in disbelief. For once, they weren't laughing at me. They weren't mocking me. They were afraid. And that fear tasted sweeter than any acceptance they could have ever offered. When Lorraine finally stormed back into the dining room, slamming the papers onto the table, I leaned back and let out a long, slow breath. My body felt lighter than it had in years. Because I realized something in that moment. I didn't need to sit at their table to win. I didn't need their approval, their recognition, their so-called family. I had built my own seat, and it was higher than any they could offer me. Still, I stayed in the kitchen. Not because I was banished this time, but because it was mine. This little space that had once symbolized rejection now felt like victory. The refrigerator hummed, the clock on the wall ticked softly. And through it all, the dining room raged with fury. I let them stew. I let them fight among themselves, pointing fingers, demanding answers. And the whole time, I sat quietly, sipping the glass of water I'd poured for myself, utterly unbothered. It was strange, but empowering, to feel so calm in the face of their storm. A year ago, their words could have crushed me. Tonight, nothing they said could touch me. Because the lawsuit wasn't just paper, it was armor, and every insult they hurled bounced off it harmlessly. I picked up the pie from the counter, cut myself a small slice, and took a slow bite. It was overly sweet, the crust a little too crumbly. But it didn't matter. Eating it there, in the kitchen, while they spiraled in the other room, felt like the most satisfying meal I'd ever had. At one point, I heard Talia's voice rise above the rest. She's not going to get away with this. We'll crush her in court. I smiled into my fork, savoring the taste. Because what Talia didn't realize was that I wasn't the one who needed to worry about survival. They did. When I finished the slice, I stood, smoothed down my dress, and gathered my things. I didn't need to stay for the rest of their shouting. The point had been made. The war had begun. As I walked through the dining room toward the front door, every eye turned to me. Some were filled with rage, others with disbelief. None of them dared speak. I paused at the doorway, glanced back once, and said softly, "Enjoy your dinner." Then I left. Outside, the night was cold and crisp, the stars bright against the dark sky. I inhaled deeply, letting the air fill me. For the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider walking away. I felt like a victor, leaving behind a battlefield where the first strike had landed perfectly. And as I slid into my car, I thought about how fitting it was that this all started in the kitchen. The place they had sent me to be forgotten had become the very place I claimed my power. I had sat in the kitchen again, but this time, I owned it. And soon, I would own so much more. The moment I walked back into the dining room, it was as if the air itself had thickened. The chandelier glowed above their heads, but instead of warmth, it cast harsh light over faces twisted in confusion, anger, and fear. Their feast lay half-eaten, turkey growing cold, wine glasses forgotten, while my envelopes sat spread across the table like ticking bombs. No one spoke at first. The only sounds were the rustle of papers, the frantic flipping of pages, the clink of a knife nervously tapping against a plate. Then Howard, always the loudest, slammed his hand down on the table so hard the crystal rattled. "This is insane!" he barked. His face was flushed, sweat glistening at his temples. He jabbed a finger toward me. "Do you have any idea what you've done, Delaney?" I didn't flinch. I simply stepped closer, my heels clicking against the hardwood. "I know exactly what I've done," I said, my voice calm but sharp enough to cut. Brielle shook her head wildly, her perfect curls bouncing. "You can't just sue your own family, that's disgusting. We've given you everything, and this is how you repay us?" I laughed quietly, bitterly. "Everything? You shoved me into the kitchen while you stole what was rightfully mine. Don't talk to me about giving." Lorraine tried to take control, her voice tight, authoritative. "This is a misunderstanding. You don't know what you're talking about. These are old documents, out of context. You'll embarrass yourself." But even as she said it, her eyes flicked nervously toward the papers in her hands. She knew. They all knew. Talia leaned forward, jabbing the edge of her envelope at me. "This isn't going to stick. We'll get the best lawyers. You don't stand a chance." I tilted my head, letting the silence stretch before answering. "I already have a lawyer, and I wouldn't have filed if I didn't know I could win." The words seemed to sink into them like stones. The room grew heavier, the bravado faltering as reality began to take hold. I let my gaze travel slowly around the table, meeting each pair of eyes that had once looked past me, through me, like I didn't exist. Not anymore. Howard shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. "You'll tear this family apart." I stepped closer to the table, my voice steady. "You already did that when you stole from me. All I'm doing now is holding you accountable." Silence followed, thick and suffocating. I reached out, picked up a stray envelope from the table, and set it carefully on an empty dinner plate. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. "This year," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room, "I brought something for everyone." The words landed heavier than the papers themselves. My cousins exchanged frantic glances. Brielle's hands shook as she pushed her plate away, the turkey bones piled high and forgotten. Talia muttered curses under her breath, but her voice lacked conviction. Even Lorraine, always so composed, sat rigid in her chair, lips pressed thin, knuckles white as she clutched the documents. It was everything I had imagined. Last year, they had laughed at me from this table, shoving me out of sight while they feasted. Tonight, their feast was poisoned not by food, but by truth. They tried to regain composure, to salvage dignity. But every attempt collapsed under the weight of the lawsuit in their hands. Howard leaned back, forcing a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "You think you're clever, Delaney, but you're just bitter. A bitter little girl who can't stand to see others succeed." I felt the sting of those words, but it didn't linger the way it used to. Instead, I straightened, my voice firm. Success built on lies isn't success, it's theft, and now, everyone's going to see it for what it is. I turned slightly, my eyes sweeping the room one final time. "Enjoy your dinner," I said quietly, the same words I'd spoken before leaving earlier. But now, they weren't a polite exit, they were a death knell. I walked back toward the kitchen, letting their arguments and protests swirl behind me. They could yell, they could rage, they could deny, but it didn't matter. The papers had landed. The process had begun. And there was no undoing it. From the kitchen doorway, I looked back once more. The scene was almost comical. Crystal glasses, expensive china, and amidst it all, thick envelopes sprawled across the plates, their edges already stained with cranberry sauce and gravy. Thanksgiving had been served, and this year, I wasn't the one left hungry. As I left the house that night, the sound of their arguments still echoing inside, I knew. The papers had landed exactly where they belonged, right on their plates. If Thanksgiving was the spark, the courtroom was the fire. By January, the lawsuit was in full swing, and the world I had once known, family dinners, awkward small talk, the occasional polite smile, was gone. What replaced it was war. The first hearing was surreal. Walking into the courthouse, I felt like an intruder at first, clutching my folder of notes, my heart thundering in my chest. But then I saw them. My Aunt Lorraine in a stiff navy suit, my Uncle Howard puffed up with false confidence, my cousins whispering furiously to one another. They sat together like a wall of stone, glaring at me as if their combined hatred could make me disappear. But it couldn't. Not anymore. Sabrina sat beside me at the plaintiff's table, her calm presence steadying me. She leaned close and whispered, "They're going to attack you. Stay focused. Let the facts speak louder than their noise." And noise it was. From the very beginning, their lawyers tried to paint me as greedy, unstable, a jealous cousin out for revenge. They spoke with polished voices, but their words dripped with venom. "Miss Whitmore," one lawyer sneered, "has lived her entire life in the shadow of her more successful relatives. This lawsuit is nothing more than a desperate attempt to gain what she could not earn herself." I clenched my fists beneath the table, the words digging into old wounds. For a moment, I was that little girl again, sitting at the folding table, hearing laughter at my expense. But Sabrina's hand tapped my wrist gently, grounding me. When it was her turn to speak, her voice rang out firm and precise. "What my client seeks is not charity or handouts. What she seeks is justice for her grandmother's wishes, for her rightful inheritance, and for the truth that has been buried for far too long." The judge listened carefully, his expression unreadable. The weeks that followed were a blur of motions, filings, and depositions. I sat across from my relatives in small, sterile rooms while lawyers asked questions, every word recorded. The tension was suffocating. Brielle couldn't meet my eyes during her deposition. Talia rolled hers at every question, as if the whole process was beneath her. Howard grew redder with every answer, snapping at his lawyer when cornered. Lorraine kept her composure better than the rest, but even she cracked when Sabrina presented copies of my grandmother's handwritten will. Watching their masks slip was both exhilarating and exhausting. Each day felt like a battle in a war with no end in sight. At night, I would collapse into bed, drained, my mind replaying every moment. Sometimes the fear crept in, whispering that I was in over my head, that they were too powerful, too connected. But then I'd think of my grandmother, of her inked words naming me, of the shoebox of evidence they never expected me to find. That kept me steady. One particular day stood out. Howard was on the stand, testifying about the estate. He insisted that all assets had been accounted for, that nothing was hidden. Sabrina, cool as ever, slid a document across the table. A bank transfer made 2 weeks after the stained estate was supposedly closed. Howard's face drained of color. "Can you explain this transaction, Mr. Whitmore?" Sabrina asked evenly. He sputtered, shifting in his chair. "That it was a loan. From a deceased woman's account?" She pressed, her voice cutting through the air like glass. The courtroom was silent except for the scratching of the stenographer's keys. Howard's hands trembled as he tried to form words that didn't come. In that moment, I felt a swell of vindication so strong it nearly brought me to tears. For years, he had towered over me with arrogance. Now, under oath, stripped of control, he looked small. But victories like that didn't come without cost. Each hearing chipped away at me. The stress gnawed at my stomach, the endless preparation consumed my nights, and the constant glares from across the courtroom threatened to weaken my resolve. Still, I endured. Because every time I thought I couldn't keep going, I remembered last Thanksgiving. I remembered being told to sit in the kitchen. And suddenly, exhaustion transformed into fuel. The most difficult part wasn't hearing their lies, it was seeing how low they were willing to sink. They brought up my personal life, my financial struggles, even moments from my past I wasn't proud of. They tried to twist my entire existence into proof that I didn't deserve anything. It stung. Deeply. But every time they tried to humiliate me, I reminded myself, humiliation was the only tool they had ever used, and I had already survived it once. This time, I had evidence. This time, I had Sabrina. And this time, I had the law on my side. The battles stretched on, each one draining yet strengthening me. Slowly, piece by piece, the truth emerged. Transfers, hidden accounts, property deeds shuffled like cards in a crooked game. With every revelation, their facade cracked wider. I began to see it in their faces, the panic. The dawning realization that they weren't untouchable, after all. That the cousin they had mocked, excluded, and diminished was the one unraveling everything they had built. And I savored it. Still, Sabrina reminded me often, stay patient. This is only the beginning. The biggest revelations are still ahead. She was right. I could feel it. The storm had only just begun. As I walked out of the courthouse one evening, the winter air biting against my cheeks, I paused at the steps and looked back at the building looming behind me. Inside, the war was raging. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the one under siege. Because now, the courtroom wasn't just their battlefield, it was mine. And I was finally learning how to win. By the time spring arrived, the case had dragged on for months. Every hearing felt like another mile in a marathon I wasn't sure I could finish. I was tired of the glares, the whispered insults, the endless legal jargon. But Sabrina kept reminding me that cases like this were wars of attrition. Whoever held out the longest, whoever kept fighting through the exhaustion, was the one who would win. Still, even with the evidence we'd gathered, I worried. My family had resources, connections, and a practiced ability to twist narratives. They could drag this out for years if they wanted. And sometimes, late at night, I feared they'd succeed. Then came the day Sabrina called me with a tone in her voice I'd never heard before, sharp, electric, triumphant. "Delaney," she said without preamble. "We found something." My heart skipped. "What do you mean?" She explained that during a deeper review of probate filings, her team had uncovered a misplaced record in the county archive. It wasn't part of the official estate file, it had been filed under a related case by mistake, likely overlooked for years. It was a letter. A handwritten, notarized letter from my grandmother to her attorney, drafted just weeks before her death. Sabrina's voice tightened with excitement as she described it. "In this letter, your grandmother specifically names you as a beneficiary. She outlines her wishes clearly. It corroborates the partial will you already have. There's no way they can argue this away." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My throat closed, my eyes stung. I pictured my grandmother's careful handwriting, her deliberate words. She hadn't forgotten me. She hadn't dismissed me the way the others always had. She had wanted me included explicitly, undeniably. It was like hearing her voice again after years of silence. When I saw the letter for myself, spread out on Sabrina's desk, my hands shook as I traced the familiar loops of her writing. The notary's stamp at the bottom was clear, unshakable proof of authenticity. Tears pricked my eyes, but this time they weren't from hurt or humiliation, they were from validation. For so long I had doubted myself, wondered if maybe my family was right, if maybe I really didn't deserve a place at the table. But here was my grandmother, speaking across time, confirming I had always belonged. "This," Sabrina said firmly, tapping the page, "is the nail in their coffin." The next hearing was different. I walked into the courtroom with a steadiness I hadn't felt before. My family sat across the aisle, their expressions smug but strained, as though they still believed they could bluff their way through. They didn't know what was coming. When Sabrina presented the letter to the judge, the courtroom fell into a silence so heavy it was almost tangible. The bailiff carried copies to the defense table, and I watched as my aunt, uncle, and cousins leaned in to read. Lorraine's face drained of color first. Her lips parted, eyes wide, as she scanned the page. Howard grabbed the paper from her, his jaw tightening as he read. Talia muttered something under her breath, shaking her head in disbelief. Brielle pressed a manicured hand to her mouth, as if she might be sick. The judge's eyes narrowed as he read the document carefully. He looked up, his voice calm but firm. This appears to be a notarized communication from the decedent to her legal counsel, outlining clear intent for asset distribution, including Miss Whitmore. Their lawyer stammered, scrambling to argue. Your Honor, this could have been fabricated, or perhaps it was a draft never meant to be finalized, Sabrina cut in sharply. The notary's stamp verifies authenticity. The handwriting has already been preliminarily matched by an expert. This is not a draft. This is intent. Clear, unambiguous, and legally binding when considered with the other evidence already provided. The judge nodded slowly, his expression hard. I'll allow it into evidence. That was it. 4 simple words, but they felt like thunder. I sat there, watching as my family's confidence crumbled in real time. They had spent months painting me as greedy, unstable, undeserving. But now, faced with my grandmother's own words, their lies turned to ash. Lorraine's hands shook as she shoved the papers back toward her lawyer. Howard muttered angrily under his breath, his face a mask of barely contained rage. My cousins avoided my eyes altogether, their smugness replaced by something I'd never seen from them before: fear. For the rest of that hearing, their arguments faltered. Every attempt to twist the narrative sounded weaker, more desperate. And for the first time, I didn't feel nervous sitting at the plaintiff's table. I felt powerful. When the judge adjourned for the day, Sabrina leaned over and whispered, "They're finished. They know it. We just have to let the process run its course." Walking out of the courtroom, I felt lighter than I had in years. The sunlight outside seemed brighter, the air fresher. I thought of my grandmother again, her lavender-scented hugs, her kind eyes. I whispered a quiet thank you to her, wherever she was, because she had saved me. Just with her words, but with her belief in me, something my family had spent years trying to erase. That night, sitting at my kitchen table once again, I spread the letter in front of me. I traced the words slowly, memorizing every curve of her handwriting. Delaney is to receive her fair share of my estate. Simple, clear, powerful. I whispered the words aloud, letting them sink in. My grandmother had wanted me included. My family had stolen that from me. But now, the truth was undeniable. And as I folded the letter carefully back into its folder, I realized something profound. I wasn't just fighting for money, property, or assets. I was fighting for my grandmother's voice, for her truth, for the piece of me my family had tried to bury. And with this letter, I knew without a doubt their fate was sealed. The courthouse was packed the day of the final ruling. Word had spread through our small town, and curiosity pulled strangers into the gallery. People whispered, heads turning as my family filed in, stiff and pale in their suits. I walked in last, my steps steady, Sabrina by my side. This was it. After months of hearings, testimony, and sleepless nights, it all came down to this moment. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded tightly together, my grandmother's pendant cool against my skin. Across the aisle, my Aunt Lorraine wouldn't meet my eyes. Howard scowled openly, his fists clenched on the table. Talia and Brielle whispered furiously, their polished confidence cracked into desperation. When the judge entered, the room rose. My knees felt weak, but I stood tall, determined not to show the nerves rattling inside me. We sat, and the judge began. His voice was calm, deliberate, but each word landed like a hammer. He recounted the evidence. The partial will I'd found, the fraudulent transfers, the bank statements, the property deeds, and finally, the notarized letter, the letter that had sealed everything. My heart pounded in my ears as he spoke, the air in the room heavy with anticipation. This court finds, the judge said, his gaze sweeping the room, that the estate of Margaret Whitmore was fraudulently misrepresented during probate. Assets were concealed, records were falsified, and rightful beneficiaries were denied their inheritance. The room stirred, whispers breaking out like sparks. My breath caught, but I forced myself to stay still. The court hereby orders that all assets identified as concealed be returned to the estate. Distribution shall proceed in accordance with the decedent's documented intent, including the inclusion of Miss Delaney Whitmore as a rightful beneficiary. I gripped the edge of the table as relief washed over me. So strong I thought I might collapse. He had said it. Rightful beneficiary. Recognized. Acknowledged. But he wasn't finished. Furthermore, the judge continued, his tone sharp now. The court imposes penalties upon Howard and Lorraine Whitmore for fraudulent concealment. Fines will be levied, and this matter will be referred to the appropriate authorities for further review of potential criminal charges. Howard's face turned crimson. Lorraine gasped, her hand flying to her chest. My cousins sat frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief. It was over. For so long they had acted untouchable, convinced their lies would stand forever. And now, in a single ruling, the foundation of their empire had crumbled. Sabrina placed a steady hand on my arm, whispering, "You did it." I wanted to cry, to laugh, to scream, but all I could do was sit there in stunned silence, my body trembling with the release of years of buried pain. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. Court is adjourned. I rose slowly, turning to look at them one last time. Lorraine's eyes were glassy, her carefully built facade shattered. Howard muttered curses under his breath, his voice low but venomous. Talia and Brielle refused to meet my gaze, staring down at the table as if hiding from the reality in front of them. For a moment, I felt a pang, an echo of the little girl who had once longed for their approval, who had wanted nothing more than to be accepted at their table. But that pang faded quickly, because I realized I didn't need them anymore. I had won, not just the case, but myself back. As I walked out of the courtroom, the reporters who had gathered swarmed with questions. Microphones shoved forward, cameras flashing. "Delaney, how do you feel? Do you have a comment on the ruling?" I stopped at the top of the courthouse steps, the spring air brushing against my face, and let the moment sink in. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel small. I felt seen. "My grandmother wanted fairness," I said clearly, my voice carrying. "And today, she finally got it." The crowd murmured. Cameras clicked. And I walked down the steps with Sabrina at my side. Each step felt lighter than the last, as though I were shedding years of humiliation and pain. That night, alone in my apartment, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at the table with the letter that had carried me through. I read it again, my grandmother's careful words steadying me. I whispered, "We did it." The victory wasn't about the money, though I knew it would change my life. It wasn't about the houses, the accounts, the property that would finally be mine. It was about the acknowledgement that I had been right all along, that I had mattered, that I had always belonged. For years, they had shoved me into kitchens, folding tables, corners. But now, a judge himself had declared what they never would. I was equal. I was rightful. I was family, whether they wanted to admit it or not. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had tried to erase me, and in doing so, they had set the stage for my triumph. Their arrogance had destroyed them. As I drained my glass, I let out a long, steady breath. The war was over. The judgment had changed everything. But the sweetest part of all? I hadn't just gained what was mine, I had finally taken back the seat at the table they'd denied me for so long. The following November, the air carried that familiar crispness, the leaves brittle underfoot, the sky pale and wide. Thanksgiving was approaching again, but this time, for the first time, I wasn't dreading it. I wasn't bracing myself for humiliation or waiting for the sting of exclusion. This year, I was hosting. I had moved into one of the properties restored to me after the judgment, a house my grandmother had once loved, with tall windows that flooded the rooms with light. Renovating it had taken months, but now it was mine, fully and completely. Every piece of it carried her memory, and every choice I made in decorating it felt like reclaiming what she had wanted for me all along. The dining table stood in the center of the room, long and sturdy, polished until it gleamed. When I first bought it, I ran my hand across its surface and promised myself something. No one would ever be made to feel small at this table. As Thanksgiving approached, I sent out invitations not to my old family, but to my new one. Friends who had stood by me during the lawsuit. Neighbors who had checked in on me when things felt overwhelming. A coworker who'd brought me coffee on mornings after grueling hearings. People who had treated me with kindness, respect, and humanity, the kind of family I'd chosen for myself. On Thanksgiving Day, the house filled with warmth and laughter, the kind that didn't sting but soothed. My guests arrived with arms full of dishes, bottles of wine, and smiles that made my chest ache in the best way. I wore the same red dress I had worn the night I served the papers. Back then, it had been armor. Tonight, it was celebration. The kitchen buzzed with activity as we prepared the meal together, chopping vegetables, basting the turkey, sneaking bites of pie. No one was banished to a corner. No one was left out. The kitchen wasn't a punishment anymore. It was the heart of the home, filled with joy instead of silence. When the food was ready, I called everyone to the table. As they took their seats, the sight of it nearly brought me to tears. The table was full. Every chair was occupied. Every place setting was neat and welcoming. And at the head of the table, where I sat, I finally felt what I had longed for all my life: belonging. We raised our glasses, and I spoke quietly, my voice steady but thick with emotion. Last year, I was reminded what it felt like to be excluded. To be told I wasn't good enough to sit at the table. But this year, I've learned something important: you don't need their approval to claim your place. You just need to believe you deserve it. Around the table, heads nodded. Glasses clinked. The moment was simple, but it carried the weight of years. As the night unfolded, laughter filled the house. Real laughter. The kind that bubbles up naturally, not the cruel kind that cuts. Stories were shared, food was passed, and every smile reminded me that family isn't always blood. It's the people who choose you, who lift you up instead of tearing you down. At one point, as I looked around the table, my eyes landed on the empty chair at the far end. I hadn't said it intentionally, but seeing it there made my throat tighten. In my heart, it belonged to my grandmother. I imagined her sitting there, watching, smiling. I hoped she could see what her letter had done. How it had changed everything. She had given me the strength to stand up, and now her wish for fairness had blossomed into something greater. After dinner, as the dishes piled up and conversations drifted into the living room, I slipped back into the kitchen for a quiet moment. I leaned against the counter, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, and thought about how far I'd come. The kitchen. The place where I had once sat in shame. Where I had once felt invisible. Tonight, it was different. I wasn't banished here. I wasn't hiding. I was standing tall in my own home, with my own family, after claiming everything they had tried to deny me. I thought back to that first Thanksgiving, the sting of humiliation still vivid in memory. They had told me to sit in the kitchen, as if that would be my place forever. But I had turned that humiliation into fire, that rejection into resolve. And now, the kitchen wasn't their tool of exclusion, it was my symbol of triumph. As I walked back to the dining room, the sight of my guests laughing, wine glasses raised, and plates still full made me smile. This was what Thanksgiving was supposed to feel like. Not division, not cruelty, not exclusion, belonging, warmth, joy. I took my seat again at the head of the table, my grandmother's pendant resting against my collarbone. The conversation swelled around me, and for once, I didn't feel like an outsider. I felt like the center. Because the truth was, I had never needed their table. I had built my own. And as I looked around at the faces smiling back at me, I knew one thing with certainty. For the first time in my life, Thanksgiving was truly mine.